Okay, today we begin a new Masechet Yoma Daf Bet. Why is Masechet Yoma studied after Masechet Shekalim? If you look at the Talmud Bavli, that's not the order. After Shekalim it should be Rosh Hashanah, it should be a different order. But the reason is because it follows the original order of the Mishnayot, not what appears in the Shas. So even though if you have a set of Talmud Bavli, it looks as if the next Masechet after Shekalim should really be Masechet Rosh Hashanah. In fact, we do Yoma, and then Sukkah, and then Betzah, and then Rosh Hashanah. It's in a different order than one would expect from looking at the Shas, because it goes by the old Mishnayot. So we begin with the first Mishnah of Masechet Yoma. Shiv'at Yamim Kodem Yom Kippurim Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mibeto Lelishkat Parhedrin. Now, much of what we learn in Masechet Yoma should be vaguely familiar to us from the Avodat Yom Kippur that we read in the Musaf of Yom Kippur. In the Musaf of Yom Kippur, in the repetition, basically what you have is a summary of everything from Masechet Yoma about Avodat Yom Kippurim. So in the very beginning of the description, if you look in the Musaf, it talks about how they separated him for 7 days. And that's what's being discussed here. So 7 days before Yom Kippurim, Mafrishin Kohen Gadol, they would separate the Kohen Gadol from his house. He had to live in a special apartment, the Lishkat Parhedrin. He had to live in this chamber called Parhedrin. Why did he do that? Basically to keep him away from Tum'ah, to keep him away from any kind of impurity, because they had to make sure that the Kohen Gadol was going to be able to serve on Yom Kippur. The only person who's able to do the Avodat Yom Kippurim is the Kohen Gadol. So if he becomes invalidated, we're going to be in trouble. So we have to make sure he stays pure. And not only do we make him stay alone for 7 days in this apartment, but we also set up a backup Kohen Gadol just in case, with all of those precautions, he still becomes tameh. So we have to make sure that there's somebody as a backup for him. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af isha acheret matkinin lo, shema tamut ishto. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not enough to make sure there's another Kohen Gadol to back him up. You also need another wife. Why does he need another wife? Because the Kohen Gadol must be married to do the service of Yom Kippur. He must be married because it says V'chiper ba'ado uv'ad beto, that he's going to atone for himself, uv'ad beto, and for his family. If he doesn't have a family, he doesn't qualify. So he has to have he has to have a wife. So therefore they set aside an extra wife, so just in case his wife dies, God forbid that should happen, but it would happen at such a time, then he would have to have another wife to back him up. Now the Gemara is going to discuss the logistics of this. There's a lot of complication with how exactly did they do that, because he's also not allowed to have more than one wife, the Kohen Gadol. So there's all kinds of complications we will see later in the Gemara. So however, the Chachamim say to him, so he continues. He says, "V'chiper ba'ado v'ad beto, beto zo ishto." That his house means his wife. In other words, he has to have a wife in order to be the Kohen Gadol. But the Chachamim said, Amru lo, they said to Rabbi Yehuda, Imken en ledavar sof. According to your logic, there is no end to it. Maybe the second wife will die. Maybe the third one. I mean, if you're going to start assuming people are going to die, en ledavar sof, there's no end to what we can imagine. So we don't assume someone's going to die. Somebody becoming impure, perhaps. Somebody dying, we don't assume. The Tosafot deals with, well, where do you measure, where do you draw the line for things like this? Why did Rabbi Yehuda draw the line at one? Okay, it's a good question. Why don't we say maybe the Kohen Gadol understudy is going to become tameh, and we need a second understudy, and no, we need a third backup Kohen Gadol? I mean, where do you draw the line? It's an interesting question to ponder. The Gemara says, Tanan Hatam, we learned over there, this is quoting from the Mishnayot of Masechet Para, which describes the preparation of the Para Adumah. And there's a similar halakha for the Kohen who is going to prepare the Para Adumah, just as the Kohen who prepares for Yom Kippur has to wait 7 days or has to be isolated in a chamber for 7 days, so too the Kohen who is going to prepare the Para Adumah has to undergo separation for 7 days. So Tanan Hatam, we learned over there, Shivat Yamim Kodem Serefat Para Hayu Mafrishin Kohen HaSoref Para Mibeto L'Lishka She'al Pnei HaBira Tzafona Mizracha, that 7 days before the burning of the Para Adumah, they would separate the Kohen who burned the Para from his house into a special chamber that was on the face of the Bira. The Bira, the Gemara is going to say later on, is a reference either to a specific area on Har HaBayit, or it's a reference to the Beit HaMikdash itself.
The one who burns, not the one who does the Shechita, right?
It's the same. It's talking about the Kohen who's going to do the avodah of the para aduma. He has to be separated for 7 days in a special chamber at the northeast side of the Beit HaMikdash. And remember, the Beit HaMikdash is laid out that the Kodesh HaKodashim is in the west. When you come in, you're in the east. So when you come in, you're in the east, and that's the west, and the north is to your right. Okay, so if you were to enter, it would be to your right, wherever this chamber is that the Kohen would be to prepare the para aduma. This is not where the para aduma was prepared. This is just where the Kohen would be isolated. And what did they call the chamber? V'lishkat beta even aita nikret. And they called this chamber the chamber of the house of stone. V'lama nikra shema lishkat beta even. Why did they call it that? Shekol ma'aseha b'chlei galalim b'chlei avanim. Because everything that they would do with the para aduma would be done with vessels that were made from gilalim, which means dung of animals, okay? Or they would use klei avanim, stone vessels, or klei adama, or unfinished earth. In other words, they didn't put it into the oven to make it into earthenware, because that would be mekabel tum'ah. But they just took hard mud, basically hard earth, and made kelim out of it. They made vessels out of it. Now, what was the reason why they had to do that? Because they wanted to they wanted to protect the para aduma ashes from any kind of impurity. And klei avanim, klei galalim, all of these things, they're not mekabel tum'ah. They can't become tameh, these kinds of vessels, because they're not made of the materials that can receive tumah, that are susceptible to tumah.
What did they put inside the utensil?
The water that they needed for it, when they would mix the ashes with the water and things like that. Everything that they did to prepare it during the burning, they would do klei avanim, because they didn't want it to be mekabel tumah. They didn't want any possibility that you were going to have a vessel that might have been tameh, touch it, or anything like that. So they took things that were not mekabel tumah. So that's why they called the place where the Kohen stayed the house of Beta Even, the house of rocks, the house of stones, because it was to signify that everything that they were going to be using, that is going to be klei avanim, is going to be made out of rocks or other items that are not susceptible to tumah. My ta'ama, what's the reason? Kevan de tvul yom kasher befara, since it happens to be that a tivul yom can officiate at the para aduma. Tetnan, as it says in the Mishnah, mitamein ya kohen asoref et hapara umatbilin oto lahotzi miliban shel tzedokin. That it says that they would actually purposely contaminate the kohen and then make him go to the mikveh in order to lahotzi miliban shel tzedokim, so that they could show the falsehood of the tzedokim, because the tzedokim said that a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen who is Tameh, let's say he touched a sheret, so he has a 1-day tum'ah. He goes to the mikveh, he cannot officiate at the para aduma. Why? Because it says, Ve'hizahat tahor ala tameh, ve'asaf ish tahor et efer hapara, right? It says that that person who is tahor is going to prepare the para aduma. They said, you're not tahor. You went to the mikveh, but you need to wait till the nighttime, till you're completely tahor.
Cannot do
That's what the Tzadokim said. The Chachamim said no. As long as he went to the mikveh, even if he has to wait till tonight to be completely tahor for other things, for para aduma he's tahor. So that was a machloket between the rabbis and the Tzadokim. So in order to show the Tzadokim, to take the wind out of the Tzadokim, right? They purposely did it. They would make the Kohen Tameh, then make him go to the mikveh, and then let him do the para aduma to show them. See, we don't care about what you say the halakha is, because we know what the real halakha is.
Who's the Tzadokim?
This was a group of people who didn't accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh. They accepted some parts of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but they didn't accept the Chachamim. They didn't accept the rabbis as authentic arbiters of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So they had their own ideas of the halakha. So the rabbis would specifically make the Kohen a tivul yom. And since they were doing that, they were already, in a way, compromising, on the laws of Tumah, because they were being so careful about the purity of the para aduma. But then they take the Kohen and they let him become tameh and go to the mikveh the same day. So it might make people think, it's not so serious, the para aduma. It's not so serious because look, the Kohen was tameh this morning, he went to the mikveh and he's doing it now. So what is it? So therefore, in every other way, they were really strict. Right? In every other way, they were really strict to make up for that. And I would explain, because the Tzadokim would say that the Kohen who did the Parah Adumah, who prepared it, had to have been completely tahor, meaning he had to go to the mikveh, wait till nighttime, and he could do it the next day. But he couldn't do it the same day. So the rabbis wanted to show that wasn't true. But once they did that, takinu la rabbanan kele galalim kle avanim ukle adama dilo lekabelu tuma ki yechid la lizalzilu ba. So they did that so that people would not lizalzilu ba, so that people would not take it lightly. In other words, once people saw that the rabbis were lenient about a certain halacha of the purity of the Parah Adumah, so then the question will be, maybe they're going to be lenient about other things. Maybe it's not so serious. So they made it even stricter in other ways. What kind of ways? Well, for example, they said that you can only use kelim, you can only use vessels that are impervious to tum'ah. They cannot be susceptible to tum'ah in any way. That shows how strict we're being. As Rashi says here on the side, he says, therefore what they did was, they made ma'alot arbel tahora. They made many stringencies with regard to the purity of the Parah Adumah in order to demonstrate that it's not that we're being lenient. That's just what the halacha is. We're not compromising the purity of the Parah Adumah. So now the Gemara goes on to say, why was the chamber where the Kohen would stay in order to prepare for making the Parah Adumah in the northeast side of the Bet HaMikdash? Since it's called a chatat, a sin offering. And normally, where do you slaughter a korban chatat? In the north, because it says, it always says that you have to take it to tzafon. You have to always slaughter the korban chatat on the north side of the Bet HaMikdash. It always says that. So therefore, this, which is also called a chatat, has to be, we put the Kohen in the north side of the Beit HaMikdash. Now it happens to be that obviously the Parah Adumah is not slaughtered inside the Beit HaMikdash. It's not a korban. It was slaughtered on a mountain facing the Beit HaMikdash, to the east of the Beit HaMikdash, facing the Beit HaMikdash, was where that would actually be prepared. Not in the Beit HaMikdash, because it was not a korban. It wasn't offered. It was burnt up into ashes. So really it wasn't a korban chatat, but since it was called a chatat, they wanted to connect to that idea of chatat, and therefore, as Rashi explains, he says that, actually that's in the next part. So then he says, so since it's called chatat, v'chatat u'natzafona, uchtiv ba el nochach pnei ohel moed, and it says that it has to be facing ohel moed, takinu la Rabbanan lishkat tzafona mizracha, tiyechid leheve la hekira. That it says that the preparation of the Parah Adumah, even though it's not on the premises of the Beit HaMikdash, has to be facing El Nochach Penei Ohel Moed. It has to be facing the Ohel Moed, which we understand it as meaning that he has to be to the east of the Beit HaMikdash, facing west. In other words, facing towards the east of the Beit HaMikdash. So if the Beit HaMikdash is over here, this is the east of it, you have to be over here further east, facing west. You're facing the eastern wall of the Beit HaMikdash when you prepare the Parah Adumah. So as Rashi explains on the side, he says that Bahazat Damashu Omed Behara Mishcha, he would stand on Hara Mishcha, and Umitkaven Vero'eh Petcho Shel Hechal Shu B'Kotel Mizrahi, and he would face the opening of the Hechal, which is to the east of the Beit HaMikdash, because the Beit HaMikdash, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, is in the west. So that's where he would face, because remember, he had to first slaughter the parah, and then he has to throw the blood in the direction of the Bet HaMikdash before they burn the Parah Adumah, and they do all the whole ritual with it. So we're not going into those details right now. But the point is that it had to be to the east, and a chatat is normally done in the north. So since we have this concept of north and east connecting to the Parah Adumah, because it's called a chatat, and a normal korban chatat is in the north, but in the Bet HaMikdash. The Parah Adumah has to be to the east of the Bet HaMikdash. So therefore, we combine north and east, and where are we going to put the Kohen in the Bet HaMikdash? In the northeast. That's where his chamber was when he was spending the 7 days preparing himself to make the Parah Adumah, because it reflects this concept. And Rashi says, Ladat shehufrash sham kedei lahatil alav avodat parah hakuriya chatat utuna mizrach. In other words, the fact that the Kohen is sitting in the northeast corner, so to speak, of the Bet HaMikdash reminds him that what he's about to do, that what he's responsible for, is for the Parah Adumah, which is called the chatat, and which has to be prepared in the east. So we send him the two messages because it's north and east. And therefore, and Rashi explains why is that important. V'yasim lev liot zariz b'ma'aseha v'seder avodoteha. And therefore he's going to make himself focused on being very careful and very zealous about all of its component parts and all of its avodot, all of its rituals and all of its steps, because he realizes how important it is. So that's why they put him in the northeast. Now the Gemara asks, "My bira? Why does it say that he's in the northeast of the bira? What's the bira?" Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Bar Chana said the name Rabbi Yochanan Makom Haya Baharabayit Ubira Shemo, that there was a place on the Temple Mount called Bira, and that's where the chamber was. In other words, according to him, it wasn't the Beit HaMikdash. It was a different place on the Har HaBayit that was called Bira, and he was in the northeast of that. However, that is not the Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, no, Kol HaMikdash Kulo Karoi Bira. What are you talking about? The entire Beit HaMikdash is called Bira. Not just one location in Har HaBayit, but the whole thing is called the Bira, Shedemar HaBira Asher Achinoti, because David HaMelech says, the Bira that I prepared. What is the Bira? The whole Beit HaMikdash. So when it says the Bira, it means the Beit HaMikdash and the northeast of the Beit HaMikdash, not the northeast of a certain area which is called Bira on the Har HaBayit. So the Gemara goes on. So Minahanimili, where do we get this idea? Where is this idea of separating the Kohen for 7 days before he does the Avodah Yom Kippur? Minahanimili, where does this idea come from? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Manyomi bar Chilkiya, Amar Rabbi Mechasya bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Manyomi bar Chilkiya said that Rabbi Mechasya bar Idi said that Rabbi Yochanan said. Amar Kara, the pasuk tells us, and this pasuk is coming from the Miluim, when the Kohanim were dedicated, the 7 days of dedication. Remember that in the that Parshat Shemini is the end of it, right? In Parshat Tzav, they're put in the Beit HaMikdash for Shivat Yamim. Right, 7 days they have to sit there. Moshe Rabbeinu was doing the service, and they were eating. Right, they were just eating inside the Beit HaMikdash, the Korbanot, and then on the 8th day they assumed leadership, and that was unfortunately when Nadav and Avihu died. But that was the 8th day. 7 days they had to sit in the Beit HaMikdash, sit in the Mishkan, and be consecrated. And what did Moshe Rabbeinu say? Kasher asa bayom hazeh, like he has done on this day, tzivah Hashem lasot lechaper alechem. Hashem commanded to do lechaper alechem, in order to atone for you, meaning the same thing of being 7 days in isolation is what the Kohen has to do when he's going to bring atonement, kapara, for you. So la'asot means, it says la'asot lechaper alechem. Two things. Hashem commanded la'asot, to do, lechaper alechem, to atone for you. La'asot elo maseh para. La'asot means that there are actually two occasions when you have to do the 7 day waiting period. One is to make the para aduma, and lechaper elo maseh yom kippurim. So when it says la'asot lechaper alechem, it's referring to two things. That there are two situations where a Kohen would have to do what the original Kohanim did, Aharon and his sons, at the dedication of the Mishkan. The 7 days of isolation. One is for para aduma, one is for Yom Kippurim. Bishlama kulei kara bepara lo mitukam. Now we understand why you can't interpret this pasuk as referring in its entirety to the para aduma. Why not? Because it says lechaper ketiv ufara lav bat kaparahi. Because it says lechaper, and the para aduma is not a vehicle of atonement. It's a vehicle of purification. It's not for kapara. So the fact that it says when should you have a 7 day isolation, la'asot lechaper alechem, it's to do when you are atoning. So the whole pasuk cannot refer to the para aduma. That's why we split it up and we said la'asot is referring to para aduma. Lechaper alechem is referring to Yom Kippur. However, why can't we say this? But how do you know it's referring to two things? Maybe la'asot lechaper alechem is one thing. Maybe it just means you have to have 7 days of isolation. La'asot lechaper alechem. This is what you have to do to atone. Meaning before Yom Kippur, but not for the para aduma. How do you know for the para aduma? So Amrei, they said, Yalif tziva tziva, that really there is a gezerah shava. We make an equation between two words and two different pesukim. Ketiv achat says here tziva Hashem lasot. Here it says Hashem commanded to do. He commanded you to do this, to stay 7 days in the Mishkan in order to be consecrated as Kohanim. And it says over there by the para aduma, Zot chukat Torah asher tzivah Hashem lemor, that this is the statute of the Torah that Hashem commanded, saying, Ma lehalan para, afkan para. Makan Perisha, Af Lehalan Perisha. Just like over there, it's talking about a para, so too over here, it's talking about a para. Meaning that there was also a para that was brought in the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, right? In the dedication of the Mishkan. And just like over there was a separation of 7 days, so too with the para aduma there's a separation of 7 days. Okay, so there's a linkage of the consecration of the Kohanim, of their 7 days of separation for the dedication of the Mishkan and the investment of the Kohanim, so to speak, the installation of the Kohanim, you could say, and the para aduma, because both of them involved the para, and both of them involved a separation of 7 days. Now, obviously, in the case of the dedication of the Mishkan, it wasn't actually a para, it was a male, it was a bull, but that's another story. Okay, now we turn to Amud Bet. But still, the Gemara is not entirely satisfied that we've proven that the para aduma requires 7 days of separation, because tzivat Yom Kippurim, maybe both the tzivat comparison is also just reflecting the link to Yom Kippur, because it says at the end of the description of the service of Yom Kippur, and he did kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, like Hashem commanded Moshe. So maybe when it says tzivah regarding the Miluim, regarding the dedication of the Mishkan, so too it's just referring to Yom Kippur. That Yom Kippur requires the same 7 days of separation that the installation of the Kohanim initially required. So the Gemara answers, Danin tziva de lifnei asiyah mitziva de lifnei asiyah. There's a difference, because in the case of the Mishkan dedication, it says Hashem tziva la'asot, right? It says that these are the things that Tziva Hashem la'asot lechaper alechem, that Hashem commanded la'asot to do. And in the case of the para aduma, it also says that that in the pasuk that was quoted just before, Zor chukat asher tziva Hashem lemor, and then it describes what you have to do. But in this pasuk from Yom Kippur, it says Vaya'as, he did kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. In other words, it says the doing and then the command. It doesn't say the command and then the doing. Okay, so we compare a case where the command is before the doing. We don't compare a case where the mention of tziva comes after the performance. So therefore, we are going to learn from tziva la'asot in the dedication of the Mishkan. When it says he commanded to do, tziva Hashem la'asot, we're going to compare that to the para aduma, where it says Hashem commanded to prepare the para aduma. But still the Gemara is not satisfied. Maybe it's telling you for all korbanot. Because it says on the day that Moshe commanded Bnei Israel all of the korbanot. So maybe the tzivah means that every time you do any korban, the Kohen has to be isolated for 7 days in the chamber. How do you know that's not? So the Gemara says, Danin tzivah mitzivah vein danin tzivah tzavoto mitzivah. That's a different language. It doesn't say the word tziva. It says biyom tzavoto, in the day of his commanding. That's different. But the Gemara says, Umay nafkamina? What's the difference? This is a very famous statement of the Devei Rabbi Yishmael. It's quoted all over the place. The Shiva Rabbi Yishmael taught that V'shava Kohen Uva Kohen, we make an analogy between Zohi Shiva, Zohi Biyah. Even though the words are totally different. One is Vishav HaKohen, the Kohen comes back. One is Uva HaKohen. They don't have anything in common. Totally different words. And yet we make an analogy between them and apply the same halachot to both. So you see that the language doesn't matter. The content matters. What it means is that the Kohen comes to the house. He's checking it for tzarat. We don't care if the Torah uses the word Uva HaKohen or it uses Vishav HaKohen. It's the same idea. So too here, Biyom Tzavoto, Tziva, what's the difference? Commandment is commandment. So why should we make a distinction? So the Gemara says, but that's only true when there's nothing else similar to it. But when we are trying to figure out which one should we compare it to, we compare it to the most similar. So if I have a choice between, normally if I had tziva and tzavoto, okay, just like I can compare the Kohen comes and the Kohen returns, Uva Kohen and Shava Kohen, even though they don't sound at all alike, okay, I can compare them. So too, I could compare Tziva to Tzavoto. The only problem is that here, there's another option. I compare Tziva to Tziva. The exact same word. So why would I compare it to a word that's not exactly the same if I have the option to compare it to the word that is exactly the same? And that's why we're going to stick with our analogy. Tziva, from the dedication of the Kohanim to Para Aduma, and say that the Para Aduma, the Kohen who's going to prepare the Para Aduma, is going to be isolated for 7 days. So now the Gemara says, but wait, lechaper elo maaseh Yom Kippurim. You said that the word lechaper means the avodat Yom Kippurim. But wait a second. Now we're going to attack that. Ve'ema kapara de korbanot. Maybe it just means all the korbanot. All of the korbanot are for kapara, right? They're all bringing kapara, atonement. So how do you know it means only the Yom Kippur? Maybe any time you need to bring a korban, the kohen who's going to serve has to be isolated 7 days. So what is the Gemara going to ask me? Yad inan hai kohen mitramei de ba'ile perisha. So how are we? The problem is, how are we going to know which kohen is going to officiate that day? Remember, everything was, as we're going to learn later in this masechet, actually, everything was distributed by the pais, by the lottery. Okay, it wasn't done by nobody knew in advance who was going to do the actual offering. So they would give it out by lottery. So since you don't know if you're actually going to be the one who's doing the offering itself, how do you know whether to separate 7 days before? It's not only the Kohen Gadol. They have a different group coming in every week, and only a certain member of that group on a given day is going to be the one who's going to be able to offer it. So Amrei, they said, very simple. The entire group that's coming for the week, the previous week, they should have to be in isolation for a week, just in case any day of that week, they're going to be asked to do a korban. So we'll put them all in the isolation chamber, so they're all ready. So what's the problem? So the Gemara says, no, that's not why we don't do it. The reason is because the reason is because when we deal with the reason why we want to make an analogy between the installation of the Kohanim and Yom Kippur is because they're both things that happen only once. Okay, the dedication of the Mishkan happened once. Yom Kippur happens once a year. It's not something that should be happening every single day. It's something that happens on a special occasion. And Yom Kippur is a special occasion. Every day is not a special occasion. Ve'ema regalim. What about the regalim? Why don't we say for the holidays, we should make the Kohanim who are going to be serving on the holidays separate for 7 days? That's a special occasion. Aren't the holidays special? Of course. We take something which happens once, once a year, and compare it to once a year. We don't compare it to something that happens 3 times a year. There are 3 regalim. So we're not going to. So then the Gemara says, no, maybe we'll pick one of them. Maybe the Torah is telling you pick one of them. How do you know it's picking Yom Kippur? Maybe it could be any of them.
But Yom Kippur is not one of the regalim.
True. No, that's the point. So it's saying maybe forget about Yom Kippur. Maybe it's one of the regalim. Because they all have series imachad lechatat. They all have a sin offering for kapara also. Lechaper alechem. That's what it always says. Right. So why not? So he said, well, that would be taken care of that's too often, right? That's already 12 times a year at least. So that's definitely not for Rosh Chodesh. So then the question is, what about the regalim? And we'll pick one. And maybe you'll tell me we don't know which one. Either we'll pick Pesach because it's the first one, or we'll say that we'll pick Sukkot because it has the most mitzvot of any holiday. Sukkah, lulav, nisu chamayim, you have lots of mitzvot. So what's the point? It says, listen, the Gemara is saying we could figure out which one. We could choose one. So the Gemara says, so therefore, why do we not pick one of the regalim? Why are we sure it's Yom Kippur? Rather, ela danin prishat shiv'a liyom echad mi prishat shiv'a liyom echad. We compare 7 days of separation for one day to 7 days of separation for one day. Vein danin prishat shiv'a lishiv'a. Okay, mi prishat shiv'a liyom echad. And we're not going to, in other words, what did they do? They separated, in the days of the Miluim, when they dedicated the Mishkan, the Kohanim were separated for 7 days, and then they had a big day on the 8th day. The 8th day was the big day. And we want to find a day that's similar to that. 7 days of separation, one big day. Pesach, it's not one big day, it's 7 big days. Sukkot, it's not one big day, it's 7, at least 7, and if you can't bring Yetzirah, 8 big days. Not one. And Shavuot wasn't even one of the contenders, right? They didn't consider that the possible choice because there's no reason to pick Shavuot. So therefore, what's the only example we have? Yom Kippur. You can say there's 7 days before, they'll be separated, and then one big day. Ve'ema Shmini de Prishat Shiva Liyom Echadhu. Why can't we say Shmini Atzeret? Make the Kohanim be isolated for the 7 days of Sukkot for Shmini Atzeret. That's one day. The Gemara says, no, Danin davar shein kiddush alafanav b'davar shein kiddush alafanav. Ve'en danin davar sheish kiddush alafanav b'davar shein kiddush alafanav. Very simple answer. The 7 days that the Kohanim were in isolation before they came and made their debut on the 8th day, they didn't have any Kiddusha. They didn't have any holiness those days. They were just regular days. And the 8th day was the special day. But if we were to do Shmini Atzeret, the first 7 days are also a holiday. They're also days of Kiddusha. The 8th day is not just a random 8th day. The 8th day is not just a debut of the Kohanim. The 8th day is the 8th day of Sukkot already. There were 7 days before. So that's not a comparison. Ve'lav kal v'chomer. But wait a second. I'll say it's a kal v'chomer. Why? Because if something that doesn't have any holiness before it is still so significant that it requires a separation of 7 days, then Shmini Atzeret should be even more holy, because it had 7 days of build-up of holiness, and then the 8th day. So if you require if the Kohanim required 7 days of separation for that 8th day, even though those 7 days were not that significant, and the 8th day was just an 8th day standing on its own, so definitely Shmini Atzeret that had 7 days of build-up of holiness, and then it is sort of the icing on the cake. Certainly for such Kiddusha, 7 days of separation should be needed. So why don't we say for Shmini Atzeret? So Amar Rav Misharshia says, Lo hazeh ketiv, kazeh. Isn't it written hazeh? It says that this thing is what Hashem commanded you to do. Kazeh. It has to be exactly the same as this. In other words, this model that we're using the model of the isolation of the Kohanim before their debut in the Mishkan. The installation of the Kohanim.
Shavuot was 1 day, and
right. So they said that
they said 3 days, stay away from your wife and all that stuff.
Right.
They're like, but how come that's not mentioned here?
But for the service of the Kohanim, there's nothing so special about it that it would be isolated. Pesach, we can understand it's the first holiday. Sukkot, we can understand it has a lot of mitzvot, even mitzvot that relate to the Beit HaMikdash. We could see why. Shavuot didn't have anything that stuck out that seemed like it was even a contender for what it would be random if that was the only holiday that the Kohen had to have 7 days of separation for, because it doesn't seem like the service is anything extra special. So now the Gemara is concluding that lo hazeh, doesn't it say hazeh, kazeh? It has to be like this. In other words, it has to be exactly comparable. So just like what the Kohanim had in the first dedication was 7 days of regular, ordinary weekday that they were isolated, and then an 8th day that was a very special day, so too, when do we have 7 days of separation? Only for Yom Kippur, because it's 7 weekdays that they're going to be separated, and then an 8th day where they make their debut, so to speak, where they enter the scene again for Yom Kippur. And the next answer actually takes us all the way through the next daf, so we're going to stop here for today.